Kakadosh Boker Tov, we're continuing today on Daf Ayin Tet Amud Aleph, 79A1. So we are by the two dots, which is actually 2, 4, 6, 8 lines down by the two dots. So 7, 8 lines down, B'mukdashim. Okay? Now we're talking about by the other different types of korbanot. B'mukdashim means in the other types of korbanot, it's not the same halacha, which means that even though the meat became impurified, and the chelev, which is the fats, the prohibited fats, are still here, we still sprinkle the blood. Okay, that's what we said in our Mishnah. So now the Gemara is going to explain. Okay, you remember we went into the machloket yesterday between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Do we, if you have one component, you don't have both, which means that let's say you only have the blood and not the meat, or the meat and not the blood. We started speaking about what happens if it got lost or stolen, or not stolen, but lost or burned, or what happens if it was got impaired. So now we're going like this. Matniti mani, who is our Mishnah? Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yoshua, it is going in accordance to Rabbi Yoshua. The Tanya, as we learned in the Braita, Rabbi Yoshua says, Kol hazevachim shebatorah, shenishtaem mahen kezayit basar o kezayit chelev, zoreket adam. So basically, according to Shitat Rabbi Yoshua, if you did the shechita, and after the shechita, it got lost, the meat, or it became impurified, as long as there was a kezait left over of the meat, or a kezait that was left over of the prohibited fats of the chelev, zoreket dam, you throw the blood, and the korban is still kosher. Okay? That is the shita of Rabbi Yoshua. So all the sacrifices, as long as you have a kezait, it's still okay. Kechetzi zait basar, kechetzi zait chelev, and zoreket dam. However, though, remember that whenever we're talking about achila is always with a kezait. So as long as you have a kezait, you're still able to eat it, and then you're able to do everything so perfect. What happens if you only have half a kezait? So says the Gemara, if you only have half a kezait of the basar, or half a kezait of the chelev, and zoreket dam, you're not allowed to throw the blood. Okay, why? Because the half and half do not combine. Meaning, when you have a kezait of basar, you're allowed to eat the meat. When you have half a kezait, right, you don't have a full kezait. You have a half a kezait of the chelev, but the chelev is prohibited fats. So the half a kezait of the chelev and the half a kezait of meat do not combine to become one full kezait, but you can't, that means the consuming of the mizbeach and the consuming of the human being do not combine to make one full entity. Okay, fine. So now says the Gemara, okay, uveola, what about a korban olah? Now remember, by a korban olah, which is a burnt offering, nobody eats anything. Everything is consumed on the mizbeach. So by a korban olah, afilu kechetzi zay v'chsa v'chetzi zay chalav zoreket, even if it's going to be half and half, you're going to be able to throw the blood. Why? Because the entire thing is going to be consumed. Which means, since anyway the entire thing is going to be consumed, so I could add on the half a kezait of the basar and half a kezait of the chalav, of the chelev, because anyway we're not eating it. It's only the mizbeach which is eating it. By mincha, which is by a meal offering, which is the flour, right? Even though the entire thing is still here, lo yizroket adam, you're not allowed to throw the blood. So says the Gemara, mincha ma'aviteh. Where's their blood by a meal offering? Right? Where's their blood? Meal offering, it's flour. Where's the blood? What are you telling me? You're telling me by all the sacrifices, you need a full kezait in order to throw the blood. If you have a half and half a kezait of meat and half a kezait of the prohibited fats, you're not allowed to. Why? Because they don't combine. Because you're not allowed to eat the prohibited fats. So you only have half a kezait. But if it's by a korban olah, which the entire thing is consumed on the mizbeach, you do combine them. But anyway, everything goes on the mizbeach. So half a kezait of meat and half a kezait of the prohibited fats of the chelev, it's okay. Now, explain to me, though, what's going to happen now in a case of the mincha. The mincha, you have a question? The mincha is a flour offering. There's no blood. So what does it mean that even though you have the entire meal offering, you're not going to throw the blood? What blood? What are you talking about? So Rav Papa says, no, we're talking about minchat nisachim. We're talking about a nisachim, which is a wine libation. That remember that the wine libations always come with a sacrifice. Meaning the wine libations always will come with an animal. Meal offerings, which is a korban mincha, does not always come with an animal, but the wine libations and nisachim does always come with an animal. So therefore, even though you have the entire nisachim still there, you will not come and throw the blood of the animal. So I would have thought to say, since this nisachim, this wine libation is coming because of the sacrifice, Kigufe de zevach dami, so it's like the sacrifice itself, which means that if the entire thing is still here, you would be able to come and bring it. Kamash Malan comes to teach you that you do not bring it, but rather that if right now, right, the blood is only going to be thrown if you have a meat, a kazait from the basar, right, or from the chelev of the korban itself, but not from the actual wine libation which comes with it. Okay, until here, everyone clear? Yeah?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Fine. So now says the Gemara, right? Before we just said that Rabbi Yehoshua brought from the pasuk "V'asita olotecha basar v'adam al mizbach Hashem lokecha," that the blood is going to be thrown only if the meat is going to be kayam, if the meat is going to be there. Now we're going to ask a question: what about if the chelev is kayam? Which means not the meat, the prohibited fats. Remember that by the animals, you always have prohibited fats, which are chelev, which basically you have to do nikur. Nikur means after slaughtering, they come and they check if the animal's a terefa or not. Terefa means they check the lungs and they check the inside to make sure that there's no scars or things like that, or cuts that would render it that it cannot live for a year. After doing that, what happens is they take away the gidanasheh, which is the back, how do you call it in English? The nerve, the back nerve, right? I forgot the
Sciatic nerve.
So the sciatic nerve. And then what happens is around there and around all that area, there's something which is called chelev. Chelev is the prohibited fats. Remember, there's shuman, which is permitted fats, and chelev is the prohibited fats. So some fats are permitted and some fats are prohibited, right? So that's just, you have to remember, right? If somebody ever asks you about a diet, you have to tell them, listen, some fats are permitted. Yeah? But what happens is what? The chelev, usually, if I remember, the chelev, the majority of the chelev is in the back. I don't remember if there's chelev on the chazeh. There is chelev on other parts as well, but a lot of the chelev is around the gidan hasheh, or a lot of the chelev. There is chelev in other parts as well, but a lot of it is there, okay? So now what happens is as follows. Now the question is, how do we know that if there's still chelev left over, do you spill the blood or not? Meaning, do you throw the blood on the mizbeach or not? Remembering that the throwing of the blood is what brings the kapara, not the slaughtering. Okay, so that's a very, very important aspect. Okay, so says the Gemara, chelev min alan. How do we know that if you still have the chelev here, the prohibited fats, that you're allowed to throw the blood? Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Ishmael, says Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Ishmael umatuba, and some people say it's mishum Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chananya. It's Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chananya. Damakar, it's a pasuk. The pasuk says, "V'zeraka kohen et adam al mizbach Hashem." The kohen is going to throw the blood on the mizbeach of Hashem. V'iktira chelev lereach nichoach laHashem. And then you're going to bring the chelev for a reach nichoach, for a pleasant fragrance in front of Hashem. Chelev, aval pishem basar. You see from here that you're going to bring the chelev even though there's no meat. Which means even though the meat is gone, became tameh, got lost, got burnt, whatever you want, doesn't matter. Even though there's no meat, you would still do it because of the chelev. So says the Gemara, Ashkechan, we're going to find this by what? We're going to find this by chelev. Yoteret hakaved u'shtei klayot min alan. How do we know that the yoteret hakaved u'shtei klayot, which is basically the kaved is the liver, but I think it's called the diaphragm? Is that correct? I don't remember how to say it in English.
Yes, diaphragm.
The diaphragm. So the diaphragm on the liver and the shtei klayot and the two kidneys, how do we know that also it's enough for them already to throw the blood? Which means even if you don't have the chelev, even if you have the two kidneys or the diaphragm, right? Or here it's much more both of them actually. It doesn't say one or the other. Yeah, both of them, right? Because sometimes the vav means one or the other, but sometimes it means and. So here it's both of them. So how do we know that you're going to throw the blood? So says the Gemara, Heicha amrinan dezarkina, right? Where do we say that you're going to throw the blood, right? And they're still going to have yoteret kaved and shtei klayot. Midiktani, right? Just like we learned, uvemincha af al pi shekula kayemet lo yizrok. By the korban mincha, even though the entire thing is going to be here, you're not going to throw it. Mincha hu delo, only by a korban mincha, which is a meal offering. Aval yoteret hakaved u'shtei klayot shapei dami, right? But the yoteret kaved and shtei klayot, you are going to throw the blood. So how do we know that? That's what Gemara is asking. Meaning, we're trying to deduce. We said by the meal offering, by the korban mincha, even though the entire korban mincha is still intact, you cannot bring the blood and spill the blood. But one second, but it's mashma that yoteret hakaved and shtei klayot, that the two kidneys and the diaphragm of the liver, you do bring it. Right? So therefore, how do we know this? So says the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan dider, Rabbi Yochanan himself says that he says, the pasuk, it says, L'reach nichoach, kol she'ata ma'aleh l'reach nichoach. Anything that you bring for reach nichoach, which means anything that you bring on the mizbeach for a pleasant fragrance, that's going to permit the blood to be spilled. you bring the shte klayot and the yoteret hakaved on the mizbeach, which means the fact that you do bring this diaphragm and the two kidneys on the mizbeach, that in itself permits it that now you could sprinkle the blood because you bring this lereach nichoach. Ve'itzrich lemichtav chelev, ve'itzrich lemichtav reach nichoach. It needed to write both of them, also the chelev and also the reach nichoach. Why? If it was only going to be written the chelev, havamina chelev in yoteret hakaved shte I would have thought only the chelev, but not the yoteret hakaved shte. So that's why the Torah wrote down the reach nichoach that it's even these two as well, which is the yoteret hakaved and the shte. Now, if the Torah would have only written reach nichoach, I would have thought only which is coming up for reach nichoach and even a mincha, right? Because the mincha, which means again not the meal offering, but rather the nesachim, right? Which is it. Right, the nesachim, the wine libation, which is wrong with it. So that's why the Torah wrote chelev, that it comes to teach you only the chelev and not the meal offering. Okay, until here we're clear? We're by the Mishnah. Yeah? Fine. Mishnah on Ayin Tet Amud Aleph. Okay? We're halfway down. Mishnah. Nitzma hakahal, or rubo, or shayu kohanim tmeim, v'akal teorim, yasu betumah. So says the halacha something very interesting. What happens if the kahal, the entire kahal, became tmeim? Or not even the entire kahal, even the majority. Or even the kohanim, which means you don't need the entire kahal, you don't need the majority, even if you have just the kohanim. But the fact that they became tumat met, the kahal teorim, and everyone else is still tahor, still in all these three cases, yasu betuma. You still do it when it's tameh. Okay? So again, either kol kahal, majority of the kahal, or the kohanim and the kahal are pure. Still, you would do it. Okay. So now says the no, the opposite. The kohanim were tmeim and the kahal are tehorim. Still, you would bring it betuma. These are the exceptions. Well, the truth is, it doesn't bring down the opposite. But that now it's going to bring down the opposite. Nitzma miuta kahal. What happens if it's only the miuta kahal? Right? No, because by the way, you should know the opposite is for sure. Because if you have the entire kahal and not the kohanim, that's already the majority. That's already the majority. You understand? That's already the majority. Ya están viniendo. Te están entrando ahora. En dos. Okay? You understood? Which means that what happened is that you already have the majority, because if you have the entire kahal and not the kohanim, that's already the majority of the kahal. You understand? You only need majority of the kahal. You don't need the full kahal. But now what about the opposite? The opposite means minority of the kahal. So the ones that are pure, they do the first korban pesach. The ones that are impure, they do the second korban pesach. Okay, that's a mishnah. Until here, clear? No, it's very clear mishnah. All of the kahal, majority of the kahal, or the kohanim, and not the kahal. The majority of the kahal are pure, or the kohanim. All three cases, you bring it betuma. If it's the other way around, which means that if it's going to be minority of the kahal, so then the ones which are pure bring it Pesach Rishon, the ones that are impure bring it Pesach Sheni. Says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, we learned in the Braita. Haresha yu Yisrael Tameim v'Kohanim u'Kli Asheret Teorim. What happens if the majority of Yisrael are Tameh, and the Kohanim Tameim, and the Kohanim and the Kli Asheret and the utensils are pure? Or the majority of Yisrael are pure, and the Kohanim and the Kli Asheret are Tameim. Va'afilu Yisrael v'Kohanim Teorim, even if everyone's clear, Teorim. But just the Kli Sharet are Tameim. So here we give you the Chedush of even the Kli Sharet. It means not even any more human beings. Beforehand, we were talking about the Kahal Yisrael, or the Kohanim, or the majority of the Kahal, or the entire Kahal. Now, all of a sudden, we brought down that even if you have everybody's pure, except for the Kli Sharet, which are Tamein, Yasu, you still do it Betumah. So even the Kli Sharet are Tamein, you bring it Betumah. She'en Korban Tzibur Chaluk. Right? Why? Because the Korban Tzibur is not going to be any different, which means that even if the miut is going to be Taor, still they're going to go with the majority, and they do the Pesach with Tumah. Which means that just like by a korban tzibur, a communal sacrifice, if they were tamim, they would bring it. So to here, they would bring it. So Amar Rav Chasta, says Rav Chasta, Lo shanu ela shenitma hasakin. That's only if the knife of the shechita became tameh v'tamemet. The Rachmana Amar, but the Torah says, B'chal al cherev, right? Hareu kechalal. Which means anything which touches the halal cherev, which is the actual knife, becomes tameh for 7 days. Right? Cherev, hareu kechalal. The cherev itself becomes a halal, which remember, we're going to go back to the beginning of Masechet. If you remember in the beginning of the Masechet, we were learning about Tumah v'Tara. When we were learning about Tumah v'Tara, we brought down a special din, a special law. You remember we gave out the papers, right? I think it was Ronen Cohen that printed them. You remember we gave out the papers and we said there was a special law regarding the knife, that the knife always obtains the same status quo as the deceased, which means usually the corpse is avia avot tuma. It touches someone else, becomes ava tumas. Touches something else, becomes a rishon, then a sheni, so on and so forth, right? Because it always goes down in tuma. And remember that according to the stringency of the food, it could become more. So, for example, a chulin is a maximum sheni, right? The sheni is a maximum chulin. By truma, it becomes shlishi. By kodesh, it could become even a revi, because according to the stringency of the food, it continues going up in tuma. Here we said, when it says bechalal cherev yitma shivatamim, which means the Torah is talking about that the cherev which touches a dead body, right, or also kli matechet, which is going to touch it, they become tameh in the same darga of the met himself, which means they become an avi avot tuma themselves. Okay, the same halacha would apply if the cherev, the kli matechet, touches a person that touches it, so they themselves become like the avatuma. So whichever that touches, it does not skip to the next level. It stays on the same status quo. It becomes like a genuine photocopy, right? But usually you remember we always said it's a photocopy. So photocopy goes down in value. It goes down one. Here it's a certified copy, stays on the same value. So that's what happens with the cherev. And it's going to be mitameh legavra. It's going to be mitameh the person that's touching it. Because at the beginning, during the time of the shchita, when they were doing the korban pesach, betumat guf de karet kamitaved. He was doing it by tumat guf, by karet, which means that if it wasn't for the fact of the tumat tzibur, they would have been chayav karet, because shchitat pesach has to be done by people which are tmeim adam, right? So therefore, that's only the reason why. But usually they would have been mamash karet, right? If a person's taman, he's bringing one of these, it's karet. But if he doesn't bring a korban pesach, it's also karet. You understand? It's like both aval nitmas sakin tumat sheretz. But what happens if the sakin only became impure because of tumat sheretz, not because of a tumat adam, only because of tumat sheretz? Now remember, adam is the only thing that becomes avi avot tumah, the father of tumot. A sheretz is an avatuma. It cannot go higher. Meaning the maximum that a creepy crawler could become is only avatuma. It's not higher. So therefore, automatically it already starts at a lower level. Okay, so aval nitma sakim tumat sheretz the basaru de metamele, which means that it's only going to be metameh the basar of the pesach, right? Vilu legavra metameh means it's only going to purify the korban pesach, because the sakin is the same as the avatuma. So now what happens? So therefore, why isn't it going to come and be metameh? The sheretz is avatuma. The sakin becomes a rishon tuma, and therefore the human being cannot become sheni tuma. Remember, the knife only stays the same status quo with regards to halal cherev, to do with the concept of a tamemet, to do with anything else it does not. Which means that if a knife touched the sheretz, the knife becomes a rishon. It does not stay the same status quo as the sheretz as a creepy crawler to become a vatuma. So if the knife is a rishon, it's going to make the meat into a sheni, but the meat cannot disqualify the human being, because the human being does not become a shlishi or even a sheni. Okay, so that's what it says here. Aval nitma sakin betumat sheretz tebasaru de metameh. It's going to make the meat tameh, but legavra lo metameh. But it cannot make the human being into tameh. Hateorin avid. So the people which are tahorin, they should do the korban pesach. The tmeim, no avid, but the people that are tmeim, no. Mutav yachel betumat basar belav, v'al yachel basar betumat aguf shu beonesh bekaret. Which means it's better that you should eat the korban pesach with tumat basar, which is only a lav. Meaning, if a person comes and he ate the korban pesach when it's impure, he's only transgresses a negative commandment. There's no karet. However, though, right, if you're going to eat it by the people themselves that are tameim, the tumat aguf, that means if the person himself is tameh, so then that's karet. So there's a big difference. If the meat of the korban pesach is tameh and somebody eats it, it's a negative commandment, but there's no karet. But if the person himself is tameh and he's eating this meat, it's karet, because he's eating kochim when he's tameh. So there's a big difference between them. So that's what the Gemara says, that it's much better in such a case. What?
Can you repeat this, please, again?
One more time. We said that when a person comes and the knife has the same status quo as the avi avot tuma only by tumat met, by a deceased person. Okay, so that means the knife becomes like the deceased person. The deceased person is avi avot. The knife is avi avot. If, let's say, somebody touched, right, and the knife touched that person that was tamemet, so just like the person that touched tamemet is avatuma, the knife is avatuma. Basically, only the knife only has the same status quo by deceased, by tumat met, not by anything else. So now, if this knife touched a sheretz maximum, the highest level of a sheretz is avatuma. It does not become aviavotuma. So since it's avatuma, the knife touches it. It does not become avatuma as well, because that's only by a deceased person. So therefore, the sheretz is an avatuma. The knife becomes a rishon tuma. The knife comes and disqualifies the meat. Remember, the meat is kodshim, so it could become even a revi'in, not only just a sheni, it could become even the fourth level of tuma. So for sure it becomes disqualified the meat. But now, this meat cannot disqualify a human being. Because a human being could only become a maximum rishon tuma. He cannot become a sheni and onwards. Right? He cannot become a sheni and onwards. He could become an avatuma, he could become well, obviously, he could become a viavotuma if he dies, right? But I'm saying, if a living person could only become an avatuma and then a rishon, he cannot become a sheni onwards. So what happens? This knife touches the sheretz. The sheretz is a avatuma. The knife becomes a rishon. The knife, you do shechita to the animal. Then now what's going to happen is the animal will become a sheni, right? Because it's kodshim, it's holy, it's holy foods. But the human being does not become disqualified. So says the Gemara, what's going to happen? It's better that all the people that are pure are going to come, they're going to bring the sacrifices, they're going to do shechita and everything. Now what's going to happen is, one second, but they're eating tameh meat, because the meat did become disqualified. But says the Gemara, it's better to do it that way than the people themselves that are tamim are going to come and do it. Why? Because if they're going to now come and eat this meat, they only transgress a negative commandment, a lav, because they are pure, but they're eating non-pure meat of the korban. So that's a negative commandment. However, though, if the body is impure, meaning the human being is impure, and he's going to eat kodshim, even if it's pure or impure, doesn't matter which one, now it's karet. Now it's a much higher level of astringency because he's tameh. How's he eating kosher, not kosher, holy things? You understand? So therefore it's karet. So alma, so you see from here, now it's clear, yeah? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
I understood. I wanted to know why it was karet.
Yeah, that's why it's karet. Because the person is tameh. If the person is tameh, it's karet. Alma kasav Rav Chasta. So you see from here, Rav Chasta holds tuma dechuyai betzibur, right? The tuma is dechuya betzibur. Vechen amar Rabbi Yitzchak tuma dechuya betzibur. So if you remember, already yesterday, the day before yesterday, we kept on bringing down machloket. Was tuma hutra betzibur or dechuya betzibur? Hutra and dechuya means is when we say that something of tuma, does it mean that it's pushed off or if it's overridden? Richard Moore used the word overridden, which means that it's an override or it's completely permitted. Sometimes I'm going to tell you, you know what? If it's already like that, okay, fine, do it that way. But it's not like lechatechila. It's not like it's permissible. It's just that, okay, this is the way. That's called dechuya. Dechuya means it's pushed off. Hutra means that it's 100% permitted. And the way that we explained it, if you remember, was klishim nachto liisur, right? Muktzeh. When you have muktzeh on Shabbat, yeah, and you're going to come and you're going to take a hammer and you're going to move it because you wanted to move it for the place or to use the body. Is it that it's pushed off, or if it's meaning it's overridden, or is it that it's completely permissible? What's the difference? If you have another kli, another utensil, which is a heter kli, so you have a nutcracker and you have a hammer. Can I use a hammer? So according to the Mishnah Berurah, he said it's asur. Why? Because muktzeh is only dechuya, which means that the tzorek ufot tzorek mukomo is only dechuya. It overrides it, but it's not that it's permitted. According to the other shitot, it's 100% permitted. Once it's 100% permitted, because you're using it for tzorek ufot tzorek mukomo, so even if you have another one, what do you care? This is permitted. They're both permitted. You can use whichever one you want. That's the yesod behind it. That's how we explained it, just that way you guys understand. So he said over here, so you see from here that Rav Chasta holds that it's dechuya b'tzibur, and also Rav Yitzchak holds that it's tumaz dechuya b'tzibur. It's not permitted, it's only just overridden. So says the Gemara v'Rava, Rava says, no, afilu t'meina miyadbi. Even the people that are 100% tameh, they could also do it. My tama, what's the reasoning? Techtiv, as it says in the pasuk, ve'abasar asher yiga b'chol tameh lo yachel, v'yesh yisaref. The basar, which is going to touch with anybody which is tameh, you shouldn't eat it, you have to burn it. Ve'abasar kol tahor yochal basar. Now, to do with the meat, anybody that's pure is allowed to eat it. So the pasuk is teaching you that a person that's tahor is not allowed to eat basar kodesh when it's tameh. Correct? Why? Because, and when a person is tameh, he's not allowed to eat basar kodesh, whether it's tahor or tameh. So if the person is tameh, doesn't matter what about the meat, whether it's pure or not pure, it's always asur. If the person is going to be tameh, if the person is going to be tahor, so he's not allowed to eat not pure meat. Now, what happens is, as long as we do not read the general rule, that you're not allowed to lo karinam be, which means like this. Since they're both written one beside each other, right? So I'm applying both of them together, which means if I'm going to use the pasuk, the meat which is going to touch anything which is tameh, you're not allowed to eat. So then I'm not going to read the pasuk that the basar kol tahor yochal basar, that's somebody that's pure, right? So then you're right that you're allowed to eat any type of meat. But kol hecha de karina be, but anytime that we do use the pasuk, right, a basar sheiga bechol tameh lo yachel, that you're not allowed to touch, that means anybody that's tameh is not allowed to eat the meat. So then we do use the pasuk, habasar kol tahor yochal basar, that anybody that's tahor only could be ochel the basar, and not anybody else. So therefore,
But-
you see from, so you see,
Yes.
one
Excuse
second,
me.
yeah. So you see from here that the isur not to eat basar kodesh when a person is tameh is only in a case where the isur is also that a person shouldn't eat basar kodesh that became tameh. So therefore, when the sakin became tameh with the sheretz, you're allowed to eat the korban pesach betumat basar, even the people that they themselves are tameh. Because since right now everybody's allowed to eat this meat, right? Because since everybody's allowed to eat this meat, so even the person that he's tameh himself, his body, is allowed to eat it. Because since I don't read the pasuk about that the meat is tameh, that I'm not allowed to eat it, and you are allowed to eat it, so then the next pasuk, which the person himself is tameh, I don't read it, so I'm allowed to eat it as well. One more time. I know it's very difficult, so I'm going to explain it one more time. Yeah? Let me just put it on pause. So it says the Gemara Itman, it was stated, Hareshadu Hayu Yisrael Mechza Teorin Mechza Tmin, a new case. What happens if they're half and half? We spoke about in the Mishnah all of Yisrael, or the majority of Yisrael, or the Kohanim and not Yisrael, or just a Kli Sharet. What about now? You have half-half. Half people, half Teorin and half Tmin. Rav Amar Rav says Mechza Kirov. Half and half is considered majority. Rav Kana says Mechza Eno Kirov. The half and half is not considered the majority. Okay? Rav says Mechza is like the majority. Halalu osin latzma, halalu osin latzma, because each one is going to do to themselves. Which ones? These ones are going to do a korban pesach to themselves, and the other ones are going to do a korban pesach to themselves. Which means that the Torim are not allowed to bring it with a tmeim. So therefore, that's why each one does it on their own. So therefore, it's going to be considered the majority. Okay? Right? But then he says, but Rav Kahana says Mechza is not like the majority. The Teorin osin et harishon, is the Teorin are going to do like the first one, and the Tmin are going to do like the second one. So you see from here that the Teorin which are doing the first Korban Pesach, even if they're going to be the minority, it doesn't matter, because since they are Teorim, right, they're never going to be patur from the Korban Pesach Rishon, and therefore the Tmim are going to be pushed off to the second one, because since they're not the majority, so therefore they are pushed off to the second one. Okay, so that's the one version. Ikadamri, there are those that say the opposite. Amar Rav Kana says, Mechza eno kirov. So now, like the opposite, we just said before, right? Why? He says this is another. Sorry, the Ikadamri is only in Rav Kahana, meaning that we're not changing Rav Kahana and the first opinion of Rav. We're just changing the reasoning of Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana already told you Mechza is not the majority, but Teorin osin et harishon. But the ones which are Teorin, they're going to do the first Korban Pesach. Okay, we're on Ayin Tet Amud Bet 79b. Utmi'in, and the people which are Tmi'in, enosin, they're not going to do it. Not the Rishon and not the Sheni, which is a Pele, right? Well, obviously, we're going to ask on this. But he's saying here, they're not going to do neither or. Not the first Korban, not the second Korban. Why? But Rishon lo avde, de lo ruba. They can't do the Rishon, but they're not the majority. But Sheni lo avdi, de lo mito, but they can't do the Sheni, but they're also not the minority either. Which means they're in no man's land. They can't do Pesach Rishon, but there's no majority. As long as there's no majority, you can't do anything about it. However, though, you can't do the Sheni either. Because the Sheni, you could only do the Sheni if you're a minority. Here, they're not a minority. They're half-half. So therefore, they're stuck. They're nowhere. So says the Gemara, one second. Tznan, we learned in our Mishnah, Nitma, Kal Orubo, if the Kahal became Tmim, the entire Kahal, or the majority, or the Kohanim Tmim became Tmim, Vakal, Teorim, Yasekim, Tuma, Rubo would have the only the majority if they do it. If it's going to be half. Lo Avdi Barishon, right? They don't do it in the beginning. So Kashal Rav. So that's a question against Rav, which means we are trying to do from our own Mishnah that it's only if it's the majority do you do on Pesach Rishon. If it's half-half, you don't do it on Pesach Rishon. So there's a question against Rav. So Amalechar Rav is going to answer you no. Ruba Avdi Kulu Betuma. If it's going to be the majority, so then they're going to do a Betuma. Palga, but if it's going to be half-half, you do Halalu Osin Letzma. But each one does half-half. Each one does on their own. So that's why it's completely different halachot. Hachinam mistaber, it's also logical to say the same thing. Diktani, because we learned in the Seifa. Nitzma miuta kahal, if the minority of the kahal, teorin, osin et harishon, utmin osin et hashni. Miut, if it's going to be by a minority, who davdi b'sheni, they could do it. But if it's going to be half-half, not. They do it in the beginning. So basically, it's much more logical to say from the Seifa exactly like Rav. Meaning from the Reisha, from the former part of the Mishnah, we wanted to ask a question on Rav. But from the latter part of the Mishnah, we wanted to bring a proof to Rav. So says the Gemara, Ve'ela kashi el Rav Kahana. But rather we have a question from Rav Kahana. What does it mean, Rav Kahana? Right? We have the question from Rav Kahana, because in a case of half and half, the Tmeim are not going to do it in the first one. So Rav Kahana is going to answer you, if the minority of the Kal became Tmeim, the people which are pure do the first one, and the people which are tameh do the second one. If it's half-half, so they do the first one, but the tmeim, they don't do nothing. So that's good according to the second version of Kahana, that they don't do nothing. But according to the first version, the Amar of Kahana, that the Torim do the first one and the tmeim do the second one, what are you going to say then? Because since the Seif of the Mishnah says that if the mute of the Kahal, they could do the Pesach Sheni, mashma, that it's half the Kahal, they can't do it. So if it's half the Kahal, they can't do it. So according to the second version of Kahana, that they don't do it at all, it makes sense. But according to the first version of Kahana, it doesn't make sense. So answers the Gemara, Amalecha Rav Kahana is going to answer you, Hu adin the same halacha will apply. The it's going to be half and half also. Torim do the first one, Tmeim do the second one. And that which we said the minority of the Kahal, since we said in the Reisha, the majority, we said the minority. But really, Be'emet, it's half-half and it's the same halacha. Okay? Even that means according to Rav Kahana, even if it's going to be half-half, it's the same halachot. Okay? So we learned in accordance to Rav, and we learned according to Rav Kahana in the two different lashonot. We learned in accordance to Rav. What happens if you have a half-half? So each one does it on their own. That means one do right bituma, and the other ones are going to do on the Tara on Pesach Rishon. Tanya Kilishna Kama, we learn like the first Lishna of Rav Kahana. What happens if they're half-half? So Teorim do the first one, Tamim do the second one. The Tanya Klishna Bata Rav Kahana, we also learn like a Braita, like the according to the last part of Rav Kahana, where it says, Haresha you send Mechza Torim, Mechza Torim, Mechza Tamim. If you have half-half, Teorim Osin Tarishon Tamim and Osin Shni. The people which are Teorim, they do the first one, and the Tamim, they don't do it at all. So basically, we just actually brought down in according to every single opinion. So we had a proof to Rav, a proof to Rav Kahana and the Lishna of Kama, and a proof to Rav Kahana and Lishna Batra. Okay? Next. Rav Lishna Batra de Rav Kahana, according to Rav and according to Lishna Batra of Rav Kahana, had the time that which we learned in the Braita, Teorino Sinin Terishon Tumim Teshni. How do you learn the second Braita? The second Braita said Mefurash that the first ones are going to, the people that are pure are going to do the first one, and the people which are impure are going to do it in the second one. According to Rav, everybody does it in the first one, but just each one to their own. And according to Rav Kahana in the Lishna Batra, the people which are Tamim don't do it at all. So how do you say, half-half? How do you split it up? So answers the Gemara, the women are more tameh also as well. The Kasavar, so he holds, Nashim Berishon is a reshut. That the women in the first Korban Pesach, in the first Korban Pesach is only a reshut, not an obligation. Reshut means that if they want, they could do it, but it's not an obligation. So dal nashim. So now, if you take away the women, right, from the tmim, they have a tmim miyuta. So now the tmim are only a minority. Umiyuta yiduchu. So therefore, you're going to push it off to the Pesach Sheni, since they're a minority. Okay. So that's how you're going to answer up according to them. Now, according to the next, the Gemara is going to ask. According to Rav in the Lishna and according to Lishna Kama Rav Kahana, how do you learn the Braita where it said that the Teorim do the first one and Tamim, they don't do it at all? How do you answer that? Because remember, according to Rav, everybody does it for sure. Even according to Rav Kahana, the first Braita, they do it on the first one and the second one, right? According to Rav, they always do it on the first one. Just, half Teorim, half Tamim. But how are you going to answer that you don't do it at all? What about that Braita? So he says, Rav is answering it, for example, that you had the Yisrael Mechza Tamim, Mechza Torim. You had half-half. There's more women than the Teorim. Yeah, Nashim Teorot, meaning that there's more women which are pure more than the Tamim. So now what happens? The Kasavar, now he holds Nashim Barishon as Chovah. It's an obligation in the Pesach Rishon. Uvasheni, but women in the second Korban Pesach is only a Reshut. So Barishona lo avdi. Now in the first one, the people which are pure cannot do it. Because since you have women add on to the pure people, so then that's it. So you counted the first one, but you don't count it the second one. So therefore, the minority can do it. Uvashani, the second one, also they can do it. Why? Because you take away the women. Since you take away the women, now they become half-half. So palga lo avdi b'sheni. If they're only half, they can't do it in the second one. So that's how he.
Sorry, Rav, maybe a stupid question. A woman who is nida cannot do the korban pesach.
A woman that is tumat nida, can she do korban pesach? It's a very good question. Continues the Gemara and says, and according to Rav Kahana, that he says palganami avdi b'sheni, that the second half, since they could also do it on the second time, how are you going to answer it? For example, you had Yisrael were half. The women are mashlimot teorin, which means the women are the ones that are making them that you have the majority, right, pure. The Kasavar, he holds that the women in the beginning are chova, and in the sheni it's a reshut. So barishon lo avdi, in the first one you're not going to do it because it's half, right? That means the women with the pure people become half. So therefore, since the women and the pure people become half, so therefore only they would do it that half. But now the second one, right? But they can't do it in the second half, because if you take away the women, so now you have the majority, which were tamim. So the majority of tamim, they should have done it in the rishon, not in the sheni. So that's why they can't do it in the sheni either. So that's how to answer Rav Kahana, according to the second answer, that you can't do it in the sheni as well. So according to Rav Kahana, Hadetanya, Hareshayu Yisrael, Mechza Teorinu, Mechza Tamim, what happens if you have half? Halalo sin latzman, halalo sin latzman, each one does it on their own. Hechim taretza, how are you going to answer it? So Rav Kahana is going to answer you tonight. It's a machloket tanaim. There's one that says Mechza Kerov. There's a machloket. Is it considered majority? You're not majority. That's a machloket tanaim. And that's it. That's how I answer it. Very simple. It's a machloket tanaim. Gufa, we're going to try to understand this brighter. If they were half Tori and half Tmin, each one does it on their own, which means on the Korban Pesach Harishon, the Tmim do it with themselves, and the Tmim do it with the Torin do it with themselves. Even if there's one extra person, they're all going to do it. Because there's no difference in the Korbanot Tzibur, which means that the second that you have 51%, you do it. Okay? No, one individual cannot make the decision. Meaning, just because of the one, you cannot make the decision. But it says in a pasuk, what does that mean? You're not allowed to eat the korban pesach be'achad sharecha, right? He says over here, right? He says you're not allowed to do the slaughtering of the korban pesach in the way that it's going to be mashpi on the shchita. So therefore, when the majority of the tzibur are going to be tmeim, just because of one person, they do not bring the korban pesach betumah, because we say that you need minimum of two people. Okay, that's what we're trying to learn from the pasuk. Lo tuchal lizboch et pesach be'achad sharech, in one of your gates, which means that you need minimum of two. You need two people to override. Meaning you cannot have 51, you need 52. Yeah, you need two people. Again, we're not talking about percentages, because it's talking about in numbers. So you have, let's say, 500 and 501. It's still not good. You need 502. You need two people to be machriya. Okay, it's not even like a 60% or 70%. We're not talking about percentages. It's just two people above, not one person above. Okay, and then the Braita is going to continue, and Bezat Hashem we continue tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Rav. Thank you.